It's surprising to hear you say that they weren't prepared for this, only because this has been building now since last February. There's been a regular cadence of confrontations, of responses, of videos, of escalation. And so I think you're right. They weren't prepared. It's obvious that there was some confusion, but it's just surprising to me given the trajectory that we're on right now with this confrontation between the two sides that seems to be getting more and more severe.
They were faced with, the choice of whether to be truthful to the situation, and so maybe they may have to escalate the situation or to de-escalate the situation. And so my understanding is that they decided to de-escalate the situation. However, if you de-escalate the situation, you will lose. And so here, their response will have to be a mixture of showing resolve, but at the same time showing restraint. So you have to mix your resolve and your restraint into some sort of a narrative and some sort of response. On the one hand, they say they would not give 1 inch of territory to the foreign country, but at the same time, they are willing to talk, even when the other side has used violence against your own people.
We heard Teodoro, the defense secretary, saying not 1 inch, not 1 millimeter will be compromised. By the way, that is exactly the same language that the Chinese Ministry of Foreign Affairs says as well. They will not concede 1 inch of territory. This parallels the dialogue that we see, you mentioned, in the Himalayas between India and China that also have a very bitter border dispute as well. So this seems to be a theme that we see around China's border disputes with its neighbors. How do we resolve a situation where both sides have staked out such stark positions that mean if there's any concession, then they will look like they're going back on their pledge, not 1 inch? How do you get past that?
The China Global South podcast is supported in part by the Africa-China Reporting Project at Wits University in Johannesburg and by our subscribers. Thank you. If you'd like to subscribe for daily news and exclusive analysis about every aspect of China's engagement in Africa, Asia, and throughout the developing world, go to ChinaGlobalSouth.com/subscribe.
Hello and welcome to another edition of the China Global South podcast, a proud member of the Sinica Podcast Network. I'm Eric Olander in Ho Chi Minh City, and today we're going to talk about the dramatic events that took place last Monday on June 17th near the Second Thomas Shoal in the South China Sea. Now, the events on that day marked a dramatic escalation in the confrontation between China and the Philippines that have steadily grown since last February. What you're hearing there in the background is the melee that broke out when China Coast Guard forces blocked a Philippine Navy resupply mission that was attempting to bring provisions and what we've now learned, construction materials, to the grounded World War II-era warship, the Sierra Madre, that serves as Manila's territorial claim to the Second Thomas Shoal. Videos of that confrontation have circulated widely on social media and clearly show a China Coast Guard dinghy ramming into a Philippine vessel, as well as Chinese personnel brandishing weapons, including an axe and batons. Philippine crews fought back with sticks and threw water on the China Coast Guard boats, and the fight resulted in a number of injuries, including a Filipino sailor whose thumb was cut off in the scuffle. Now, unlike previous confrontations when videos were available almost immediately, this time it took a couple of days for the Philippines military to release footage. And when they did, that was on Wednesday last week, the story took off. And that sparked another battle, this time to shape the narrative over what happened on Monday. And now I want to walk you through a sequence of events that have led up to where we are today. So on Thursday, Chinese Foreign Ministry spokesperson Lin Jian addressed the issue at the regular press briefing in Beijing. Now remember, this is 1 day after the videos were released. And just before I read what he said, it's really important to note the different naming conventions that are used in this issue. So the Chinese referred to the Second Thomas Shoal as Ren'aijiao, and the Filipinos call it a Yungan Shoal. You're going to hear both of these shortly, but just remember they're talking about the same place. Okay, here's what Lin said on behalf of the Chinese Foreign Ministry 1 day after the videos were released. The The Philippine side is falsely accusing China. Zhengaijiao is part of China's Nansha Qunzhao, and it is Chinese territory. The Philippine side illegally intruded into the waters of Zhengaijiao without China's permission, which violated international law and the spirit of the Declaration on the Conduct of Parties in the South China Sea. This is sheer provocation, Lin said, and has no justification whatsoever. He goes on to say, the Philippine side threw water and hurled objects at Chinese enforcement personnel. These acts clearly escalated tensions at sea and severely threatened the safety of Chinese personnel and vessels. The Chinese side took necessary measures in accordance with the law to safeguard its sovereignty, which was lawful and justified, and done in a professional and restrained manner. It was beyond reproach. He ended by saying, we urge the Philippines to stop infringement and provocation at sea at once. Otherwise, the consequences shall be borne by the Philippines. Now, let's listen to how China's response was carried on Chinese state media after Lin's statement.
China urged the Philippines to immediately stop infringement and provocations on the Zhengaijiao issue and return to the right track of properly managing differences through dialogue and consultation as soon as possible, a Chinese Foreign Ministry spokesperson said on Friday. Spokesperson Lin Jian made the remarks at a regular news briefing when asked to comment on the recent moves by the Philippine military at Zhengaijiao, China's Nansha Qunzhao.
In Manila, the reaction was very different. All week, we really hadn't heard much from Malacalang Palace. We hadn't heard from Marcos. We hadn't heard from, really, they hadn't said much at all. It was very quiet for much of last week. But as the video circulated, public anger in the Philippines started to grow, prompting a lot of people to ask that in a situation where the Chinese Coast Guard personnel used weapons and even injured a sailor, why didn't the government activate the Mutual Defense Treaty with the United States and call on the U.S. Navy to finally get involved? The government tried to calm things down and say they did not consider activating the U.S. Defense Alliance. Then on Friday, we heard the first statement on the issue from Malacalang Palace when Presidential Assistant on Maritime Concerns Andre Centino held a press conference and clearly sought to minimize last Monday's incidents as nothing more than a, quote, misunderstanding and accident.
Sir, last na po on my part. Does the Philippine government consider this as an armed attack po?
No. This was probably a misunderstanding or an accident. We are not yet ready to classify this as an armed attack.
Throughout much of this time, we had also not heard from President Ferdinand Marcos. But on Sunday, he went to the headquarters of the Western Command that oversees military operations in the South China Sea to award medals to the sailors that were injured in the June 17th melee. He never mentioned the word China once in his speech to the troops, but that was clearly the focus, and you'll hear how he's trying to mobilize patriotism and nationalism for what could be a prolonged struggle with the Chinese.
Today, as your Commander-in-Chief, I have never been prouder of the brave women, men, and not just the Western Command, but the entire armed forces as I am today. I salute the 80 officers and troops who sailed the waters and exercised the greatest restraint amidst intense provocation. You demonstrated to the world that the Filipino spirit is one that is brave, determined, and yet is compassionate. I reassure you that you have the entire nation behind you, praying for your safety, praying for your success. We remember that on June the 17th, we made a conscious and deliberate choice to remain in the path of peace.
But the president's remarks were not enough to satisfy critics who are still caught up on his administration's claim that what happened on June 17th was simply a, quote, misunderstanding. So the administration then sent out Defense Secretary Gilbert Teodoro to hold a press conference on Monday of this week, and you're going to hear how the government really changed its position on what happened.
We see the latest incident in Ayungin not as a misunderstanding or an accident. It is a deliberate act of the Chinese officialdom to prevent us from completing our mission.
And before we get on with our discussion today, I also want to share one more remark from Teodoro's press conference that really, and it gets to the crux of the problem as we look forward to what's going to happen next.
We would also like to categorically state that our policy in the West Philippine Sea has not changed. As declared by the President in numerous instances, we will not give up an inch, not even a millimeter of our territory to any foreign power. We will continue to defend our territory and exercise sovereign rights thereon as we see fit. We reiterate that we seek neither permission nor consent from anyone in performing our sworn duties in the West Philippine Sea. In this regard, we will continue our rotation and resupply missions on a regular basis. The welfare of our troops in the BRP Sierra Madre being a matter of utmost importance.
And then one day after these tough remarks coming out of Manila, the government now says it wants to negotiate with the Chinese. So we've had a lot of back and forth coming out of the Philippine side. The Chinese side is really continuing to push hard. I know this is a lot to process, but I wanted to make sure you're up to speed on everything that's happened in the past few days, because it has been one of these stories that's moving at lightning pace right now. And it helps us to better understand what we're going to talk about in our discussion today. To help us put this all into perspective, I'm thrilled to be joined by Professor Alex Vuving from the Daniel K. Inouye Asia Pacific Center for Security Studies in Hawaii. He's been following this issue very closely. Professor Vuving, thank you so much for taking the time to come on the show. We really appreciate it.
Thank you, Eric.
Well, let's first start with your reaction to both what happened on June 17th and then the events over the past week that have led us up to where we are today.
Yeah, so thank you very much for your question. First of all, I need to, because I work for the U.S. government, and so I need to make a disclaimer that whatever I say today, I say here in this podcast, are my own opinion, and it doesn't reflect the views of the U.S. government or any of my employers. And back to the Second Thomas Shoal, I think the incident is very interesting, and also very interesting is the long wait the Philippines government to wait until and after the incident until they have come up with some sort of narrative about what happened. And I think that this is the time that they needed to craft to calibrate their response to the incidents. The incident has elevated the heat to a very high level, and any truthful description of what happened may cause a lot of outrage and may send the Philippines on a slope where it's very hard for you to stop before it goes to some sort of a larger conflict. It shows me at least that the Philippines government is really keen on maintaining control, keeping this conflict with China over the Second Thomas Shoal below the threshold of a military conflict. And so I just put myself in the shoes of policymakers like President Marcos and his advisors. And that was, after the incident, they saw the escalation of Chinese using forces. Not military force, but at least some sort of Bronze Age weapons, right? And so they were faced with, the choice of whether to be truthful to the situation, and so may have to escalate the situation or to de-escalate the situation. And my understanding is that they decided to de-escalate the situation. However, if you de-escalate the situation, you will lose. And so here, their response will have to be a mixture of showing resolve, but at the same time showing restraint. So you have to mix your resolve and your restraint into some sort of a narrative and some sort of response. And so that was, the few days, that was the time for them to craft that response, where we have seen now that on the one hand, they say they would not give 1 inch of territory to the foreign country, but at the same time, they are willing to talk, even when the other side has used violence against your own people. I think that's the situation that we have right now.
And how much do you think, because there's a lot of speculation as to why we heard two very distinctive narratives come out of Malakalang Palace. We heard the misunderstanding, an accident statement that came out on Friday, and then on Monday, this was a provocative, assault.
Yeah.
And do you think that reflects divisions within the administration on how to respond? Do you think that this reflects some disagreements, or how do you explain these different approaches?
Both. I would say that it reflects the psychology of somebody who is of a group of people who are confronted with a very difficult situation where you have to show your resolve on the one hand, but at the same time, you have to show your restraint. You have to restrain, and so you have to mix both black and white, resolve and restraint. And so you can see that I think that here the Philippines has not been so prepared for this kind of situation. And so each person would come out with very spontaneous sort of description of the situation. And so we have a mismatch of, responses. After the dust settled down, I see that's just a mixture of resolve and restraint, which is very logical. It makes a lot of sense for somebody is involved in such a gray zone conflict.
It's surprising to hear you say that they weren't prepared for this, only because this has been building now since last February. There's been a regular cadence of confrontations, of responses, of videos, of escalation. And so I think you're right. They weren't prepared. It's obvious that there was some confusion, but it's just surprising to me given the trajectory that we're on right now with this confrontation between the two sides that seems to be getting more and more severe. Let's also make it known that in the days after this event, the Chinese deployed 4 warships, including 2 destroyers, near the Second Thomas Shoal. Also this week, as we're recording this podcast, they've just deployed their largest Coast Guard vessel into the area as well. So the Chinese are really continuing to show force. And in many ways, there's an escalation because it's moving beyond the gray zone tactics that you talked about, which are Coast Guard and maritime militia. These are these informal fishing boats that are serving part of the Chinese fleet to occupy the South China Sea and to assert China's territorial claims in the South China Sea. So we're seeing an escalation of presence. Now, the Filipinos, in one sense, are only able to be in this fight the way they are because they have this treaty alliance with the United States. Otherwise, there's no way that the Philippine Navy could ever, or even the Philippine Coast Guard, match the power and the strength of the Chinese Navy. What dynamic does that play into the calculations, in your opinion, in terms of the confidence that the Philippines have to assert these territorial claims, knowing that they've got this 1951 mutual defense treaty that allows them to call the United States if they want to then get into the fight?
Yeah, I think if you compare the Philippines with China, China has been pursuing this kind of gray zone operations for decades against the Vietnamese and against the Philippines, or many years ago. So they have been very prepared for that. They are a master of gray zone operations. The Philippines is I think learning on the job, and for some years during the Duterte presidency, they didn't have the political will as well as the opportunities to learn. And so now you see them a little awkward in this situation, but they are learning, and everybody has to learn because this is not something that you can get from your textbook. This is not a military conflict. So that's why I think the Philippines is still, learning. Now, for the Philippines, I think they should be more confident because they have the mutual defense treaty with the United States. Now, this mutual defense treaty is not something that you are going to use in a conflict. No, it's sort of deterrent. For the Philippines, they have a great deterrent in their mutual defense treaty with the United States, which will not be used in a gray zone conflict, but it's a deterrent to keep the conflict under the threshold of war. So that I think it's an asset for the Philippines, and that may make some people in the Philippines a little overly confident. Some people may be a little less confident, but I think they are learning to adjust to the situation.
Now, last year in an interview with Bloomberg, President Ferdinand Marcos Jr. said that he would only activate the Mutual Defense Treaty in the event that there was an existential threat to the Philippines.
The U.S. has weighed in. It constantly points to Article 5 of the Mutual Defense Agreement, which was signed in 1951. It now says that it now extends to all armed conflicts, armed attacks in any area of the South China Sea. In practice, what exactly does that mean?
Perhaps that's an incursion, for example, to occupy, which has already happened, but we're still trying to keep it peaceful. But you see, we are avoiding. We avoid, as I said, we think about peace in the national interest. It does not serve any purpose to heighten tensions, to say, okay, I am invoking now the Mutual Defense Treaty. And that I don't think anyone wants that, unless you've asked a very difficult question here. Unless the effects are such that it is a threat, it will become an existential threat to the country.
Again, it was hard to define what an existential threat to the Philippines, and most people interpreted that as being a land invasion of the Philippine mainland. So then that took the conflict out of the South China Sea and put it into a different context. Then in Singapore at the Shangri-La Dialogue, he said something very different. He said that in the event of a death, so he lowered the bar for the standard of what it would take to activate the Mutual Defense Treaty.
President Marcos, I'm going to ask you a very direct question, if you don't mind, which is, if Chinese Coast Guard water cannons killed a Filipino sailor, would that cross a red line? And then can you also give us a sense of what are the actions that would trigger a request from Manila to Washington to invoke the U.S.-Philippines Mutual Defense Treaty? Thank you.
If there was an incident that ended up killing a Filipino serviceman, be they a Coast Guard or in the military and part of the Navy, well, that would be that would certainly increase the level of response, and if by a willful act on a Filipino, not only serviceman, but even a Filipino citizen, if a Filipino citizen is killed by a willful act, that is, I think, very, very close to what we define as an act of war, and therefore we will respond accordingly. And our treaty partners, I believe, also hold that same standard.
This then prompts a lot of concern that when now we start to see injuries, and again, when you see the China Coast Guard vessel ramming into the boat that was out there, it doesn't feel like we're far away from a death happening. And these water cannons are incredibly powerful. These water cannons could easily kill somebody at sea. And then to your point, though, is that the gray zone seems to have moved out of just pure Coast Guard, because let's not forget that it was a Filipino sailor, not a Coast Guard personnel. He was a Navy sailor who had his thumb cut off. It was a Philippine Navy vessel that was there. The PLA Navy deployed a squadron of 4 vessels, including 2 destroyers, into the theater. We are moving closer to the militaries getting involved. In many of these incidences, when you look up overhead, there are U.S. military drones and Poseidon P-8 surveillance aircraft that are circling overhead. So the idea that this is purely a gray zone civilian confrontation, we seem to be moving away from that because there's a lot of military hardware in very close proximity to one another.
Yeah, so the gray zone is by definition something that you can't define, and, it's somewhere in between black and white. And where's black, where's white? It's going to be defined in the practice. And you may, forget your definition of yesterday, and you come up with a new definition today, and so on and so forth, in order to adjust you to the situation. The thing is that both the Philippines and China want to keep their conflict in the gray zone, rather than escalate them into a military conflict. Now, whatever the definition of a military conflict, they will define when is a military conflict and when it's not, based on their interest at time. And so I would think that, President Marcos may have to regret his announcement, his declaration at the Shangri-La Dialogue about death.
That could box him in. Because if it does, there's a death, then people will say, listen, you said there was a death. Now call the Americans.
Right. But that is also part of his deterrence, because if he wants to deter, in order to deter China, he has to lower the bar. Remember, even Marcos doesn't really know what does that mean when something constitutes a military conflict for him in his confrontation with China. And so in rhetoric, he would put out some red light for the enemy to be scared of. But on the other hand, he would have to be flexible. And so we cannot rely on any definition of a military conflict or a war or whatever else. Even if the international law defines war as such and such and such, but in reality, if you don't want to escalate things into a war, you still have ways to de-escalate, to describe the situation in a way that would keep you under the threshold of wars. And so again, we see the last week the description by some people in the Philippine government that this is probably just a misunderstanding and so on and so forth. So even if one or more people died because of Chinese action, you can still say, hey, this is an accident, this is a misunderstanding and so on and so forth. Because the thing is that both China and the Philippines wants to keep their conflict under the threshold of war. They have a lot of interest not to escalate them into a war.
Yeah, no, and it's interesting you say that, because one of the theories that's been circulating is that the Chinese are trying to find out where is that line that the Americans will get involved. And so there is this steady escalation, this increased pressure, the different tactics that are being used, more aggressiveness. And, well, is it this the line? Or is this the line? Or is it this the line? And one of the things that I wrote last week in a column analyzing this is that, and I got a lot of pushback from this, ironically, from quite a few Americans, actually. And I said that I think that the Americans might be well served by doing what the Chinese are doing. And what the Chinese did is by deploying that squadron of destroyers, they're sending the message to say, listen, if you push this, this is what's going to greet you. This is what's waiting for you. I think, and I'd like to hear your reaction to this, that there might be some value for the 7th Fleet to start making an appearance near the Second Thomas Shoal, either under the guise of freedom of navigation, but also to really convey that if the Chinese keep pushing the line, this is where this is going to end up. There is some concern now in the discourse in the Philippines that the United States is all talk but no walk. Every single time one of these events happens, you get this statement from the ambassador or from the embassy or from the State Department that says the relationship is ironclad. We restate the Mutual Defense Treaty. We even including Coast Guard kind of interactions, blah, 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 blah. But they haven't seen the muscle behind to support the Philippines in these moments right now. And in fact, there was a very, Richard Heyerden, who is a very popular commentator, wrote a column this week saying, you know what, where are the Americans? And so I wonder if there's value for the United States to make a stronger appearance in these contested areas. I'd be interested to get your take on this.
Well, I think this is a very complex situation. And of course, generally, in a gray zone contest, you have to show your resolve. And showing your resolve in a credible way, you have to show your muscle. Right.
But the Philippines don't have a lot of muscle. Let's be honest here.
Right.
I mean, they don't have, they have narrative, but they don't have muscle, because at the end of the day, China has the muscle in this duel.
Right. But they probably don't have to use their military muscle, in this mission to resupply the Second Thomas Shoal outpost and to bring some construction materials to the scene in order to build something to reinforce the warship or so on. And so, and I would advise them to use not their military personnel, but maybe their more civilian, like Coast Guard personnel. But, it all depends on the actual capabilities of the Philippines. Maybe their Coast Guard is not capable to do that, and so they have to use their sailors, similar to what they did with the Scarborough Shoal more than a decade ago, they have to use their naval ship because they have no similar Coast Guard ship to confront the Chinese. And so that was their disadvantage, because the disadvantage for the Philippines is that you have to use your military personnel in a gray zone conflict. We do not know the classified information about what happened with the Philippines resupply mission. Maybe they have been successful in bringing construction materials to Second Thomas Shoal. And so that's why the Chinese were so angry and decided to cut the thumbs of a Philippine personnel. If you are confronted with a situation where your mission has already been accomplished and you don't want to get it into a war, and you can just pay the price of one personnel being injured, that's fine. But the real thing is that I have already accomplished my mission. If the Philippines has already successful, succeeded in bringing construction materials to Second Thomas Shoal to the extent that they can build something permanently on the reef, then I would de-escalate. I don't want to escalate it anymore because I have already accomplished my mission for this time. So we don't know that information, so that it's very hard for us to assess and to judge the situation, whether or not the Philippines is doing the right thing, or whether or not the United States is doing the right thing. However, you have the optics, right? The optics is about, you're too timid and you're so on and so forth. But that is just temporary, I think.
So this issue on the construction materials, just in case you're not familiar with it, is this idea, this is to the audience who's not familiar with it, which is this World War II warship, the Sierra Madre, is just falling apart. I mean, this thing is decrepit. And the Chinese, what they want to do is they want to see this thing go away. They want to see it collapse, because at that point, then they can claim this is ours. There's no more territorial claim that the Filipinos can stand on. And so the Chinese have said, you cannot bring construction materials to bolster this thing up. And for those of you who haven't seen the pictures of it, we're talking about one major typhoon away from the Sierra Madre getting wiped away. So the Chinese have said, you can bring humanitarian provisions only if you ask for permission. That just riles the Filipinos, who say, we don't need to ask for permission. You heard Teodoro say that in his statement. So the Financial Times last week did confirm for the first time that the Filipinos were bringing construction materials. And interestingly, in the June 17th confrontation, one of the vessels, the Philippine Navy vessels, was an up-armored Navy vessel, which was a small little ship that had metal plates around it. Think of a Humvee protected against IEDs. This was the equivalent at sea, where it was basically just a metal box that could withstand the water cannons. And the suspicion is that inside were the construction materials. So just wanted to kind of bring everybody up to date on why the construction materials are such a sensitive issue in this dispute. Very quickly, because our time is running short, I'd like to compare and contrast how the Philippines is reacting to the territorial disputes with, say, the Vietnamese, who are taking a totally different approach. So the Philippines is doing this thing called assertive transparency, where you have these videos that show up usually sometimes within an hour or two of the confrontations. They're bringing journalists aboard. They're really documenting all of the confrontations with the Chinese. They're really, again, it's a big media space and a big media battle between the Filipinos and the Chinese. The Vietnamese are taking a totally different tact, where they are not publicizing any of the confrontations that they're having with the Chinese. The Chinese are coming into Vietnam's exclusive economic zone. There's a lot of tension in the South China Sea with the Vietnamese. And by the way, the Vietnamese are moving very quickly to reclaim land around the Paracel and the Spratly Islands. 692 acres has been added just in the past year to one of their outposts. So this is a hot issue between Vietnam and China as well. How would you compare and contrast the Vietnamese tactics with the Filipino tactics with regards to their differences with China over the South China Sea?
Yeah, you see the contrast between Philippines' conduct and Vietnam's conduct today. But actually, I think the Philippines, President Marcos has learned a lot from the Vietnamese conduct in the South China Sea against China in the last several decades. And if you compare the current standoff between the Philippines and China over the Second Thomas Shoal with the standoff standoff between Vietnam and China in 2014, when China deployed a giant oil rig into the Vietnamese EEZ in 2014. The standoff lasted for 2.5 months. And Vietnamese did the same thing, as the Philippines today. They held the line and they ferried international journalists to the scene for them to capture the situation, for them to video, to do all the reports and videos, everything from the ground, and so make the conflict an international headline. So I think that the Philippines today is simply copied all of the success recipes that Vietnamese applied in 2014.
But that was a decade ago. Since then, the Vietnamese haven't done that, though, right?
The thing is that, so now, on the one hand, the Philippines' conduct regarding Second Thomas Shoal resembles the Vietnamese conduct with regard to the oil rig crisis in 2014. On the other hand, Vietnam also learned another lesson from that, because at the same time when the Vietnamese were confronting the Chinese on the South China Sea, there were also huge protests in Vietnam, inside Vietnam, and the protest blasted into some sort of rampage, in some sort of violence against Chinese nationals. Actually, against
it was against a lot of nationals. They went after Taiwanese, they went after Chinese.
Yes. They burned the factories, they killed the people, Chinese people, and so on and so forth. And that was very negative for Vietnam, both in terms of the optics and also in terms of their reputation as a destination for international investment. And so the Vietnamese learned negative lessons from that. And subsequently, you see the Vietnamese try to keep a tight lip over whatever happened in the South China Sea. They would not, publicize the Chinese harassment and in the South China Sea, and they would only protest China publicly when it's almost over, when they have no other resort. And so that's very a different way. You see that different way because of that. But basically, I think President Marcos has learned from both the success and failures of his own predecessor, President Duterte, but also from Vietnam, how the Vietnamese handled China in the South China Sea.
So let me just close our discussion on the dilemma of finding a resolution here, because we heard Teodoro, the defense secretary, saying not 1 inch, not 1 millimeter will be compromised. By the way, that is exactly the same language that the Chinese Ministry of Foreign Affairs says as well. They will not concede 1 inch of territory. This parallels the dialogue that we see, you mentioned, in the Himalayas between India and China, that also have a very bitter border dispute as well. And S. Jaishankar, the External Affairs Minister of India, has said not 1 inch, and the Chinese have said not 1 inch. So this seems to be a theme that we see around China's border disputes with its neighbors. How do we resolve a situation where both sides have staked out such stark positions that mean if there's any concession, then they will look like they're going back on their pledge, not 1 inch? How do you get past that? Where's a solution here that we can see the two sides actually backing down?
On the one hand, when they say that not 1 inch, at the same time, they can all still offer talk to each other. They can talk to each other even using secret channels. The 1 inch, the way for them to signal their resolve. On the other hand, they also have to signal their restraint. And they have, we have seen the Philippines signaling their restraint by, saying the incident was just a miscalculation, a misunderstanding, or an accident, and then offering, talks to the Chinese. China would also do the same. They also have, when they need to de-escalate, they will have, way to do that. And so we can look at how the Chinese de-escalate during the oil rig crisis with Vietnam in 2014, right? They simply, they have several rounds of secret talks between the two countries. And then all of a sudden, the Chinese decided to withdraw their oil rig ahead of plan, saying, hey, saying that they need to withdraw it because of weather. they can find very different excuses in order to de-escalate. But at the same time, still, save your face. You have to save your face. You have to mix a lot of the turn rhetoric, like the 1 inch, in order to show your resolve and also to bluff your opponent. But at the same time, if you need to de-escalate, you're gonna find very different ways to de-escalate. And at the same time, still save your face. So that's just the art of a gray zone conflict.
One of the best solutions that I heard was to turn the Second Thomas Shoal and some of these other shoals into scientific research zones where both countries could have scientific vessels go, but it would not be militarized. And I thought, okay, that seems to be a productive type of solution that could potentially come out of this and take us down from where we are today in terms of the heightened escalations. At this point right now, though, it seems that the tensions are only going one way. It's a little bit scary, but Alex, you've been invaluable in helping us to look at this in a more nuanced way, and I really appreciate your time. Alex Vuving is a professor at the Daniel K. Inouye Asia-Pacific Center for Security Studies. That's a U.S. government think tank based in beautiful Hawaii. So you have one of the best jobs in the think tank world, being in paradise there. Once again, a reminder that his comments today are his personal comments and not those of the United States government by any means. But we do value all of your insights today. So thank you so much, Alex, for joining us. I really appreciate it.
Thank you so much.
And we want to thank you for taking the time to join us for another episode of the China Global South podcast. Cobus and I will be back again next week with another edition. Until then, I'm Eric Olander in Ho Chi Minh City. Thank you so much for listening.
The discussion continues online. Tag us on Twitter at ChinaGS Project and visit us at ChinaGlobalSouth.com. If you speak French, check out our full coverage at projetafriquechine.com and AfriqueChine on Twitter. That's Afrique with a K. And you'll also find links to our sites and social media channels in Arabic.